Good evening. I would like to call this September 12th, 2022 workshop session to order. May I have roll call, Madam Secretary?
Thank you, Madam President. Everyone except for Layla Vandenberg is present and accounted for.
Thank you. If you'd please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. As we do not have any public comment tonight, we will move into consent. Do I hear a motion to approve the consent items?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Kirschner. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Any discussion? Thank you. We will now vote. All those in favor of the consent items, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries 4-0. We will now move on to our workshop topics of the evening, starting with our social studies program evaluation. Dr. Amy Dudley.
Thank you. And so this evening, I would like to introduce Mrs. Ann Arroyo, our Director of Curriculum Instruction. Mrs. Arroyo oversees our English Language Arts programming as well as our social studies programming. And she has just completed a program evaluation and materials adoption for social studies. And so she's going to share some of those recommendations and engage us in some activities. Mrs. Arroyo.
We good? Can you hear me? Good evening. I am really excited to be here tonight to talk to you about our recent K-12 Social Studies Program evaluation. Tonight, we're going to talk about a few items. First, we're just going to go over the process that we use always in Carmel Clay Schools in our program evaluation process, regardless of the content area that we're studying. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll talk about our recommendations that were the result of our work over the last year. And then we will engage you as part of our workshop time today in one of our recommendations for the next 6 years as part of our findings. We'll have a little activity that we'll engage in. And then finally, we'll just kind of wrap up with talking about what comes next and what we're working on currently and what you can expect to see happening over the next 6, maybe 7 years, provided we don't have another global pandemic that sets us back a little bit. So we're just going to start by talking a little bit about our process. You've heard this and seen this before. We always start with committees. And with this group, we had actually an elementary committee, a middle school committee, as well as a high school committee, made up of a broad base of our teachers, instructional coaches, parents, administrators, and even at the high school, we had 2 amazing high school students who helped participate in that committee and provide feedback to us along the way. Our overview typically kind of follows this similar sequence. We always start with that committee work, really trying to understand what our current program is. So we look to our previous recommendations, we look at what we're doing really well, we look at the things we want to work on moving forward, and we really try to understand our story. Where are we in social studies at this moment in time? Then we take some time to really review the research, best practice, and standards. We look to our data sources, we analyze what is our current program currently doing well, what do we maybe need to work on a little bit further, so we'll look for trends within our data. And from there we look to determine strengths, needs, and challenges. So we'll look also at, I don't know if I talked about, we'll look at the literature and what the literature is guiding us to, and then we start to look for gaps. What are things we're doing well, but what is it that we need to do working going forward? And this graphic helps me kind of talk a little bit more about what that gap analysis looks like. So we look at lots of data, which for social studies can be sometimes a little bit challenging because we don't have a ton of very social studies specific data, but we do look at items such as our 5th grade iLearn results that is social studies focused. We look at our course grades in grades 6 through 12. One piece of data that's newer to us and that we really has actually been really helpful is looking at our PSAT and SAT. scores specifically in the evidence-based reading and writing practices that are specific around reading of history and social studies text. So that really gives us some nice insight into how kids are analyzing historical text. And then also looking at our AP and our IB test scores and course enrollments. We also take quite a bit of time to look at the literature. So what is the research telling us about social studies programming and where we should be going? What are those trends? A couple things that we really focused in on. We looked at lots of different pieces of literature, but we looked specifically at our local standards, so our Indiana state standards. We also look at our national standards and frameworks. So our national standards are actually called the C3 framework, and while Indiana does not adopt those standards, there are a lot of practices embedded in there that we can use and we'll be talking about moving forward, using those in conjunction with our standards. Two texts that we looked at that were really helpful for us. One was a book study that we actually did with all of our 6th through 12th grade teachers the previous year, which is called Why Learn History When It's Already on Your Phone, which I know is a question that comes up in many of our classrooms, like, why do I have to learn this? I can just Google it. Well, there is a reason why we should be learning history, and that also really has lots of implications of how we should be learning history and social studies. We also studied an oldie but a goodie, Mike Schmoker focus. He writes about a lot of different curricular topics, but he has a whole section just on how we provide more focus within our social studies education experience. And then one final piece of data that really was probably the most insightful was our focus group work. So we did meet with teachers. We also met with parents, but our favorite groups were talking to our students. So we actually met with 6th through 12th grade students in small group, asked some really open-ended questions, and not surprisingly, we were really impressed, stunned, and driven in our work by their responses. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So as we think about our recommendation and framing our recommendations, one of the things that we kind of keep coming back to as we did this work was, what was our why? What was our vision? And I think the answer is clear from our friends at the IDOE. They have this in their overview of our social studies standards for kindergarten. So they say, the goal of social studies education is for children to develop thinking and decision-making skills that prepare them for responsible citizenship in a democratic society. So already with our 5-year-olds, this is our goal. And this is a goal that we continue to focus on and grow all the way through our 12th grade social studies programming. So now we kind of know where we're going or what we want to do. And so our recommendations that follow really are how we're going to get there. These are the areas that we'll continue to work on over the next 6 years and will be our touchstone when we're working on professional development. They also were kind of our guiding pieces when we start to look at materials. So this committee that worked on program recommendations actually then transitioned into selecting social studies materials K-12. So we had a very busy year in this work. So our first recommendation is really about the emphasis of depth of learning over broad content coverage. And this is really representative, and this iceberg is representative of the internal conflict our social studies teachers face every day. Through our discussions with our committee, the standards were discussed at every single meeting as being one of our biggest barriers to implementing a program that complements what we know about how students learned and what we know about our vision. And while we're required to teach the standard, the sheer number of content standards that you feel pressure to cover are overwhelming to our teachers. And if they're overwhelming to our teachers, they're also overwhelming to our students. So in some cases where we have over 70 to 80 standards to teach, many of those with multiple targets within one standard, it's really nearly impossible to teach all these standards and teach it well to levels of mastery where it will carry forward beyond the year. So this is really a question that we grappled with at every meeting, was how do we design a curriculum that honors the standards while not getting lost in them and not losing our students along the way. So the DOE does help us with this a little bit, and we often refer back to this front matter within our Indiana standards. This is guidance from the DOE in the introduction to their standards, And they state, and it's in bold here, that every standard has a unique place on the continuum of learning. Omitting one will certainly create gaps, but each standard will not require the same amount of time and attention. The Indiana academic standards must also be complemented by robust evidence-based instructional practices geared to the development of the whole child. By utilizing well-chosen instructional practices, social emotional competencies, and employability skills can be developed in conjunction with the content standards. So furthermore, the DOE really recommends in all of their work with us that we prioritize key standards and go in depth for some and just mention and kind of use others to carry those priority standards forward. So we spent considerable time with our committee then using this guidance to really prioritize the standards, decide what it was we wanted to spend most of our time with, and then that also helped us in developing curriculum maps and select materials moving forward. So this idea is also supported by brain science. This is from Why Learn History When It's Already on Your Phone. Not surprising, I think, to all of us here, that memory is most powerful when it's purposeful and selective. It requires that we possess stories and narratives that link facts in ways that are both meaningful and truthful and provide a way of knowing what facts are worth attending to. The design of our courses and curriculum must be an exercise in triage, making hard choices about what gets thrown out of the story so that the essentials can survive. We need to be willing to identify those things that every American student needs to know and insist upon them, while paring away vigorously at the rest. So this is tricky work, but it's worthwhile, and taking the time to really prioritize standards, curate resources, and develop activities that make what we study meaningful is critical to ensure students not only master the standards, but really carry that learning forward into the future. So moving into from the what content do we teach, we really move into what do we do with that content. And that leads into our second recommendation, which is prioritize historical thinking and disciplinary literacy skills. When we think about the work of historians don't just consume facts and spit them back out. Historians ask questions, they look to additional sources and narratives, they interpret, they analyze, they debate. They look to the happenings of the past, and they learn about how it impacts and influences the present and the future. So this is the work we want our students to engage in as well. And our standards also encourage us to do this. Embedded within our historical theme standards in every grade level, you'll find historical thinking standards. So this is just a sampling of some of the standards, and you can see how it progresses. It starts as young as in kindergarten and first grade. They define that historical thinking really starts with chronological thinking. So something as simple and basic, but also very developmentally appropriate for first grade would be using terms like past and present, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and thinking about chronology and putting events in sequence. When you go up into 8th grade, it starts to evolve into looking at how you start to differentiate between facts and historical interpretation of facts, looking at a historian's narrative and how that reflects his or her judgment about a particular event, all the way into our 11th grade U.S. history, locate and analyze primary sources and secondary sources related to an event or issue of the past, discover possible limitations in various kinds of historical evidence and differing secondary opinions. So our standards are full of facts. That's a part of what we do. We study history, we study geography, we study economics, we study civics and government, but they're not meant to be taught as just facts alone. We're supposed to do something with those facts, and our standards support that work. In our 6 through 12, they go even further into identifying literacy standards that are specific to the discipline of social studies. So here you can see these standards are set up in grade level bands, grades 6, 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12. This is an example of one that is about constructing meaning from social studies texts and deals specifically with citing evidence from primary and secondary source documents. Mike Schmoker, in his book Focus, really talks about the purpose of social studies. He says that, as Weinberg and Martin write, our democracy's vitality depends on teaching students to be informed readers, writers, and thinkers of the past as well as the present. We don't appreciate deeply enough the outsized value of social studies. If we did, we would do more to preserve its soul: literacy, analysis, and argument. The soul is not facts and spitting them back out. So this is important work. This is hard work, but it's important work. So that really leads us into one of our big recommendations. Recommendation number 3 is really getting into the inclusion of diverse narratives and perspectives through primary and secondary source document analysis. So one of the challenges we find in K-12 social studies is that the materials available to us are typically more of the same, adoption after adoption. I did the last adoption. I can tell you the U.S. history book did not change so much. They look very much the same. And it makes sense that it would. They're aligning with our standards. And the standards also have not changed so much over the last, I don't know how many years. Dr. Dudley could probably say they probably look the same as when she did social studies standards and adoption. The companies are going to align to our standards. So what we get is really a textbook that's designed to be efficient. And so in their efficiency, often textbooks oversimplify complex things that happen in our world. And that's because they're trying to cover things like early civilization, BC, all the way to modern day, covering the entire Eastern world, and all the cultures, religion, geography, economics that are involved within that. So they can't cover every single story, and that doesn't mean they're going to cover it all very well. But through the inclusion of these narratives and perspectives through the primary and secondary sources, we can bring these stories to life. And some of that is picking the stories that we really want to emphasize. So it goes back to that prioritization work. So finding the stories that are going to engage kids, that's going to make social studies meaningful to them, and really digging into these narratives and these stories. So we are going to do a little activity. We're going to do a primary and secondary source inquiry about one of the most famous and beloved heroes, probably in modern American history, and that's the story of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. So you have at the dais by you should have a folder with a gold sheet of paper on it, and I don't want you to open it yet. Does everybody have one? Don't worry, I won't make you say your answers out loud. Okay, so I'd like you to just take 30 seconds. Think about what you know about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. Just boycott. Close your eyes. Think about what you learned as a child, maybe the stories you've heard at school or as an adult. Jot down just anything you can think about what you know about Rosa and the bus boycott. A couple of things you might help prompt you to think about are, what do you know about who Rosa was? Where did Rosa sit on the bus? What happened to her that day? Why do we remember her? Is there anybody else in the Montgomery bus boycott that you can think of that you learned about in this process? So just on your own, take about 30 seconds. Jot down what you know. Okay, wrap up your last thought and then turn to a partner sitting next to you and just talk about what you know. So buddy up and take about 1 minute to share and see if you have some of the same things. Okay, take about 10 more seconds. Okay, so now wrap up your last word and then eyes back to me. Thank you. In your folder, you're going to take out just the blue sheet of paper that's inside your folder. This is a summary of an author who wrote about Rosa Parks' life, went through lots of social studies textbook and kind of synthesized what most of the textbooks, the theme in the textbooks that he found about telling about the story of Rosa. So take just a minute, it's pretty short, read through that, and when you're done, I want you just to talk to your buddy again and what in that information confirmed your knowledge of what you know about Rosa Parks and the bus boycott. Okay, talk to your partner. Did this confirm what you knew, or was it mostly the story you had written on your yellow paper? Was it a little different? Okay, let's come back together. So thumbs up or thumbs down, was this mostly about what you thought when you thought about the story of Rosa Parks? Mostly? Okay. Almost every single story in a textbook always seems to start with talking about Rosa being tired. She was very tired. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. You're going to learn a little bit more about that. So we're going to actually do some reading like a historian. This is a historical thinking chart. Many of the skills you see here are what we see in our historical thinking standards and also our literacy standards for history in grades 6 through 12. But when we look at primary and secondary source documents, some of the skills we engage in for historical thinking and reading like a historian are sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading. This helps us really to get inside a story by analyzing a primary and secondary source document. We're going to, for the purpose of tonight, really focus on corroboration. So what do other documents say about this story? Do the documents agree? Why or why not? And then which documents are most reliable? So we're going to dig into a couple of documents here. So we have three sources you're going to take a look at. The first source you'll see is a diagram of the bus where Rosa sat on December 1st, 1955 when she was arrested. This is the actual diagram that was used in her court case and was signed off on by both the prosecutor and the defendant. The second is from a picture book called I Am Rosa Parks, and it was actually written by Rosa Parks along with Jim Haskins as a co-author. And the third text is from a journal where an interview with the author, Alden D. Morris, is actually relaying an interview that he talks about or that he wrote within his book, The Origin of the Civil Rights Movement. So you'll see an excerpt of that interview and a summary of the interview that is in this book specifically about Rosa Parks. So in your folder, you'll find these three documents that are paper clipped together. Two are very quick to read. One's a little bit longer, but just for the sake of time, kind of skim and scan these three documents. And then we're going to talk about what was maybe surprising or be talking about with your partner. What's something that was new, surprising, different, or confirming the story you already knew about Rosa. So I'll give you a couple minutes just to read on your own and work with your partner. heavy lifting for the end of the evening. I'm sorry about that. Okay, talk to your partner a little bit about just some things that maybe you found that were either corroborating your story or maybe were telling a different story than you had known. Okay, so let's come back together. What were some of your ahas in reading some of these source documents? We have some primary and some secondary source documents here. Do you want to just share out a few of your ahas?
This has been something that I have been thinking about a lot over the last few years about, was it me just not paying attention, or was it, and I talk to my kids about this who are 26 and 23 often, or was it that this is exactly how it was taught with huge gaps in the information? Uh, because I do notice that their understanding of things is much different and much more layered and textured. So it must be from the standards changing rather than that I just wasn't paying attention. Because I'm an avid reader, I would have had the opportunity to fill in these gaps if the texts were there.
Absolutely. And again, when we rely just on one text, a textbook, which has its purpose, has its place, but if that's the only medium that we use to tell the stories of history, we're going to miss the texture. We're going to miss this. We're going to miss the humans in the story. And it doesn't necessarily diminish the story we all learned, the story I knew, that seems to be the same story everybody else got. Doesn't mean that Rosa wasn't amazing, because she still is, even in this not completely accurate story of Rosa, she's still an amazing hero within the civil rights movement. But now we see her in a totally different way, right? We see her not as a frail seamstress who was tired at the end of the day. She was 41 years old. In my mind, she was this little grandma who just was tired. She had worked so hard all day. Well, actually, she was an activist. And she had gone to school to, just a month or two earlier, as we learned from Eldon Morris, to actually learn how to to protest and to protest effectively. And she wasn't sitting in the sacred 10 seats that were white only section of the bus. She was actually sitting a few seats rows back. So that part of the story was also just inaccurate. Why was it inaccurate? Was it because it's easier to tell that story? It's easier to say those first 10 seats, she wasn't allowed to sit there. We oversimplify the story and we lose the heart of it. We lose the humanity of who Rosa was. When we talked with our students in grades 6 through 12, this theme was not lost on them. They commented quite a bit and quite emphatically that they felt like too many of our stories didn't have the people in them. and they were missing the mirrors for themselves, particularly our students of color, our girls. They were also missing the windows for students to learn more about these people in history. And by taking the time to really dig into Rosa's stories, we can look at how does it impact them in the present. So knowing that Rosa was this activist, she wasn't just, an accidental person who became the forefront of the civil rights movement. She was there for a reason. She actually had some purpose. So what does that teach our students about what do you want to do when there's change? It doesn't just happen by accident or kismet. It may be you have to work really hard and you have to get a lot of people together to make that change happen. Um, and so when we start to pick those stories that we really want to tell deeply and take kids through this thinking like a historian, we start to challenge them to look at how are these other accounts different from the textbook version. Who has an account that's reliable? So we could look at secondary sources that are not reliable and talk about how do we know this is a good source? We know that in today's world with the information that comes at kids all day long, teaching students how to identify what's a reputable source and not, or do some lateral sourcing to decide, is this really quite accurate? Or looking back at where is the originating source? Those are all things our students really need to do to be really strong citizens in today's society. And then looking at corroborating those stories. And this is just one element, looking at it through the lens of Rosa's story we all know so well. Um, and Rosa, I think, we all hear about how tired she was, but she says in her own words, she wasn't tired physically, she was just tired of giving in. And so we've taken this idea of Rosa being tired where really she was just tired of this happening and wanted to stand up to this. And the other piece that we also have to do in this work that's important is expanding that narrative too. So Rosa, yes, she is the symbol of the Montgomery bus boycott for sure. But it's interesting that she's the one we hear about when there were literally thousands of other people who were instrumental in making this change. Again, thinking about our students, if they just think it's one person is going to be the only person that makes the change, it's a larger act. If you want to have this kind of change or impact into your future, it's not just one simple little thing. It's actually pretty complex. This is just a quick interview with Joanne Robinson. She's actually credited with being one of the reasons why the Montgomery bus boycott was actually successful and actually happened. She was laying the foundations for bus boycotts years prior to Rosa. And she talks a little bit about this. This is in 1979, the interview, but she was at the time the president of the Women's Political Council during the Montgomery bus boycott, and actually prior to that as well.
It was a spontaneous act from those persons who were not members of the Women's Political Council. But we had worked for at least 3 years getting that thing organized. The night of the evening that Rosa Parks was arrested, Fred Gray called me and told me she was arrested. Somebody's on her bail, but her case would be on Monday. And I, as president of the main body of the Women's Political Council, got on the phone and I called all the officers of the 3 chapters. I called as many of the men who had supported us as possible. And I told them that Rosa Parks had been arrested and she would be tried. They said, you have the plans, put them into operation. I called every person who was in every school and every place where we had planned to be have somebody at that school or wherever it was at a certain time, that I would be there with materials for them to disseminate. I didn't go to bed that night. I cut those stencils. I ran off 35,000 copies of the little foyer that you have. And I distributed them. I had classes from 8 to 10 at the college. And at 10 o'clock, I had 2 senior students who had agreed to go with me. I took them in my car. The packages were already there. It would take about a half a minute to drive on a school campus. The kid would be there. In just a minute, they would disappear.
So in 1955, she's copying 35,000, stenciling and copying 35,000 pamphlets and flyers, distributing them all within a day's time. and really was waiting for that moment, waiting for that spark that happened with Rosa. Rosa had been denied her seat and said no, thank you before. But it was this moment in conjunction with Joanne Robinson that really launched the movement. And she goes on in this interview to talk about, shortly after this, how she then brought this one-day boycott to to ministers who were meeting, which included Dr. Martin Luther King. And they had to convince Dr. King and the other ministers that this cause was ready to really explode and that should go beyond one day. So it was Joanne Robinson, it was the Women's Political Council who were really instrumental, along with Rosa Parks, along with the thousands of people who gave up transportation for over a year and figured out how to make it work to keep that boycott going, that were the reason why change happened. So it really opens and expands the story that we all know and we thought we knew so well about Rosa.
It was a spontaneous act from those.
So we already talked a little bit about why this work is important. I had a student who showed up at one of our focus group interviews, an AP student, who came with her AP textbook in hand and with errors that she had found in the AP textbook. And it was errors specifically about her culture, her religion, and she went on very eloquently to tell us why all of these things in this AP textbook were incorrect. And it wasn't because AP was putting out purposely incorrect information, but again, it's oversimplifying, trying to condense an entire culture, an entire religion, literally into a paragraph that this student was saying, let me tell you, I've been studying this my whole life. It's more complicated than this, and as a result, this is not accurate. So we have to teach kids to be advocates and stewards for knowledge. And our social studies books, one way to get them there, but we have to teach them to think beyond that. And that's really what this work is about, and that's really what this whole program recommendation is really pushing and working on. Which really leads us into our last recommendation, which we engaged in a little bit of inquiry today, but teaching with and for inquiry. Inquiry is really the vehicle for which all of our previous recommendations can be carried forward. So our C3 framework, which is the framework that was developed by the NCSS, the National Council for Social Studies, and it has national standards, talks about this inquiry arc where you work on developing questions and planning inquiries. You start with compelling questions that kids are interested in learning about. Then you go into applying those disciplinary tools and concepts, so that historical thinking, that disciplinary literacy, historical thinking. And then you're evaluating sources, you're using evidence, and then you're taking that into conclusions and taking informed action. So it really gives a why for studying social studies for our students. And this comes from the inquiry design model, which is the model that was that kind of encapsulates the C3 framework. And they talk about when we teach with inquiry, we have a content goal. When we teach for inquiry, we have a thinking goal. The trick is for us to do both simultaneously, to teach with and for inquiry. So we're not getting rid of content. We're not saying we can't learn about history and facts, but we also have to have thinking goals for kids as well. And this is why children and youth are sent to school. This is what social studies education is for. It furnishes students' mind with the subject matter of history and social sciences and imports them to reason with evidence, sourcing, contextualizing, corroborating, questioning. Inquiry is the blade that can cut through the crust of conventional wisdom, leading the thinker into the unknown, thinking the not yet thought. And so often we think of social studies as being just remembering the past. We want kids to be able to think of things that we haven't even considered yet when we think about social studies. And this design path, this blueprint we're using with our middle schools and we will be moving it into our high school, was also used to really help select the materials that we picked for elementary. And this is the model that really encapsulates or ties a little bow around all the things we want to be working on, starting with content, having a good content angle, crafting a compelling question, using our disciplinary sources to sequence content, getting curiosity going, and then having kids answer a question that's based in argument, and then extending it into informed action. And last but not least, this is Kathy Swan. She is one of the designers of the Inquiry Blueprint and the C3 model, talking about why inquiry is so important.
So why is inquiry so important to social studies? I guess I would start at the real macro level, that inquiry is important to being human. It's what we do as humans. We ask important questions every day, and then we seek to find the answers to them. And so inquiry is really a natural human process that exists outside of social studies. And so what makes inquiry meaningful for social studies is social studies is really about being human, what it means to be human, and why humans do the crazy things that we do, and how to become more humane. And so it only makes sense to make inquiry at the center from a content perspective, in social studies. Beyond that, social studies is really about citizenship. How do we prepare our youngest citizens to take on the democracy and their role in a deliberative democracy? And so, inquiry is really training for life. So because students need these skills, we began the C3 framework to really elevate the purposes of social studies from just a memorization of a list of canonical dates and names and places to something more meaningful, something at the heart of good citizenship. Knowing things is important. We believe that knowing things is important, but doing things with that content is also important. Being able to become an engaged citizen, to be able to have difficult conversations with people that are different from you is really at the heart of a deliberative, diverse democracy. And so inquiry is a construct that allows students to practice good citizenship, because when we inquire, we have to consider different ways that we could answer really tricky questions, and we have to explore why or why not we would answer those questions in that way. And so inquiry is really a space, it's a sandbox, you could say, where students can play with deliberative conversations about issues and problems and ideas that are critical to living in a diverse democracy.
I love that idea that our classrooms are sandboxes for learning how to be a good citizen in our democracy. So just to wrap up, what's coming next with our programming? We have already started the process of curriculum mapping, particularly in grades 6 through 12, where we're trying some still traditional things, but also some new things. In our 6th through 8th grade classrooms, instead of a new adoption that would just include another kind of same old textbook that covers lots of content that typically teachers end up using more as a resource instead of a core. As the years go on, we're working with Newsella to create custom digital content that includes social studies textbook content, but also primary sources and secondary sources that are aligned with our curriculum maps. So we've shared curriculum maps with them, and we're in that blueprinting process where they're helping us develop the sources for which teachers will use to be teaching with. And it'll be a blend of lots of different types of sources to, again, help focus our students in on those key learnings, those essential standards, but also provide access to lots of different ways to learn about them and not just one singular story. In our high school, in our core required courses such as U.S. history, government, sociology, econ, we've adopted, we've kind of taken an interesting path. We've gone with an open source digital textbook, but we also have class sets of the hard copy books for when kids really need to have a book in hand to read. But the digital open source textbook allows for constant updates and changes. So if there's content in it that somebody says, hey, this isn't right, or this isn't exactly accurate, or new information comes to light because it's 2022, we might need to add some new information in, it can make those immediate updates. And then again, alongside bringing in lots of diverse resources to supplement that textbook and to supplement those narratives. And then in elementary, we continued on in our journey with TCI as our elementary adoption. But TCI also did quite a bit of work in their newest edition to bring in lots of primary source documents, even in secondary source document work, even into the into starting with kindergarten, and including inquiry and the inquiry framework as how they're laying out their new content. And the very last thing, which is new, you may or may not know a lot about yet, the state has, we have some new legislation about teaching of civics in our middle schools. So we will be, starting next year, required to teach a semester of civics and civic-specific standards in 6th grade. Originally, this was set up to be an additional required course beyond 6th grade social studies. Instead, the state has revised it so that they have given us a semester of civics coursework and civic standards, and then taken a years-long course in the Western world from ancient civilization to modern day, and said, teach those standards instead of a year, you're going to teach them now in a semester. They did take out 7 standards and push them up into 7th and 8th grade for geography. So we actually mapped last spring to the new civic standards for a semester so that we could get prepared. We didn't want to have to go and revise those maps a year later. So we are actually this year starting with teaching civics already and getting ready for that transition that will be required to do next year. So with that, thank you for your participation and time. We're really excited about what's to come in social studies and making some of these big shifts, and hopefully get some true historians coming out of Carmel Clay schools in the next 6-7 years. So if there's any questions, I'll take them at this time.
Thank you so much for your time. Board, I'm sure. Yes, go ahead.
So there is a limited amount of reading that one can do during one course? I would imagine overloading them for one. So is there any coordination between the other disciplines where if you're learning about something in social studies and there may be some great books or other texts that they could incorporate from an English class or sociology class, that there's a broad overview for the year amongst the study?
Yeah, it's trickier as they get older. Elementary, much easier. We actually have been doing some work, and I know this probably doesn't answer the question you're thinking of, but in kindergarten and 1st grade, and aligning some social studies trade books along in our literacy block in order to expand language comprehension and the science of reading. That's a whole other board presentation. But bringing in some of those content area themes into the literacy blocks, especially to expand background knowledge and vocabulary for our youngest readers. We know that that is critical to overall reading comprehension once kids master the alphabetic code. So some of that work is happening in the elementary. Middle school, we do have places where there's some overlap. We just started a new adoption with new novels and resources in our middle schools as well. So there are some overlaps. Not a ton, but we do have some places where we can build background within our literacy block for social studies content. High school, it gets really difficult just based on the coursework that kids take. One of the things that I'll be working with and have already discussed with our social studies department chair, particularly for those of you who have ever witnessed kids taking world history in 9th grade, they go from, kind of a very supported social studies experience to another type of supported experience at the high school, but you are covering a lot of content. There's a lot of reading. So talking more so with our social studies teachers about how do we prioritize and find the content to really focus in on and go deep, and then what are some strategies in terms of literacy that we can bring in to support that building of background knowledge, that building of vocab, so the reading is not so overwhelming. Because there is a ton of content. So it's trying to prioritize what we're really going to emphasize, and then building scaffolds and support for all kids. A lot of that content, even for our top performing students, is very foreign and unknown to those students. So it's new concepts and new content.
Sorry, and then one other thing, is there any, I'm not exactly sure what the open source textbook means, but would there then be any gaps for families that may not have access to broadband or reliable broadband? Is that a virtual textbook?
It is a virtual textbook, and it can just be accessed online. The text we're using is called OpenStax. And you can also download, so if we knew a student was having difficulty with that, we can download chapters of that textbook into PDFs for them and just have that shared with them and within Canvas. We also purchase for every classroom a class set of textbooks that are shared between classes. And we purchase extras for that reason, so that if a student needed to have access to a print text at home, they could borrow a book and take it home as well.
Thank you very much.
Ms.
Yeah.
Jackson?
Wow. So it's not a competition, but this presentation falls into the top 3 school board meetings I've been a part of. It's in close competition with math, the math workshop we had.
I'll get that Rhonda Peterson.
Yeah.
Roger said the budget's
I'm.
coming up.
Yeah, get excited, budget.
Wait till the end of the meeting.
There's so much. I don't know if I have a question, but I'll share a couple things. I do have 2 students, one at the middle school level and one at the high school level, taking these history and social studies courses, one of which was in APUSH, which is AP History. She also took the African American Studies course. And the work that you are doing is impacting them. They come home and they talk about, the experience of learning these concepts and when we go in depth and when we don't. They have talked about it ever since they were in elementary school. And I just love that we are evolving, because I've had a student come home and say, I just don't think that it's fair that they're teaching one side of history. And to see us evolving to give more of a complete picture, I think I will sleep better tonight. So I want to thank you there. I also
I'll
want to
just credit
say,
our teachers on that, and our department chairs at the middle
Yeah,
and high
yeah, yeah.
school. They've been focusing on that
let's
work for a
cascade those
long
thank
time.
yous down to all our social studies and history teachers. I will also share with you, navigating these topics with students when they are the minority in the community, but also in the classroom. I have my students come home, my 2 children, a son and a daughter, say, it's really hard to talk about slavery, and I'm the only Black kid in the classroom. Sometimes it's hurtful because people are looking for me to say, X, Y, and Z, and the pressure's on me, and I don't think that that's fair. But they persevere because they know that these topics have to be discussed. So thank you for navigating them very carefully. And then I'll also say, as I still call myself a new school board member. This game runs for 4 years, and I'm 2 years in. One of the things I'm super grateful for is we have a team that has an inquiry-based mindset. So, I have to step on my soapbox and say, if you're running for school board with a vendetta or some kind of agenda that does not lend yourself to having an inquiry-based mindset, the same one that we require of our students, I would ask you to think again about whether or not this is the place for you. Because everything that we are doing is impacting the students at the end of the day and teaching them how we navigate leadership so that they know how to navigate leadership. So just thank you for pointing out that inquiry-based mindset that we're teaching our students. And Roger, how much of the budget is supporting this? You're going to talk about that?
And I'll add as well to your question about your own children coming back saying, these are, really hard. I feel like the spotlight's on me to answer all life's difficult questions, especially when it comes to, racial challenges that we're experiencing in the text or, triggering language that can happen in a classroom, sometimes by accident. As in the video they talk about, our classrooms are sandboxes for learning. And so one of the things our social studies department chair did on his very first day of school was worked with one of our instructional coaches to talk about, because our teachers are nervous about it too. And they don't always know what to do when it happens, and they don't know if they should say something or pretend it didn't happen or move on. And so that's hard for them. And then our students, particularly those who are the minority in those conversations, who everybody looks to for the answer, they express that's hard for them. And they don't feel like they need to carry the burden of educating everybody else about a topic sometimes. So we really worked, we had one of our coaches go and work with that whole social studies high school department on what do you do when this happens, and gave them some strategies and frameworks for thinking about and being prepared so that when things are said or tough topics happen, they have some tools to pull from to make sure that everyone feels heard and respected. One of the things we talked about is that we don't call kids out, we call them in. So trying to be proactive in that work, because that's challenging for our teachers and that's challenging for all of our students as well. And that work we're trickling down to the middle level as well.
Thank you. Just really appreciate that. And the other thing is, if you're a parent, just know that, much or all of what is taught is online. I mean, I literally looked at some of our social studies materials that my son was looking at or working through last week. So parents can access this information if they would like.
Gia?
Yeah, well, I want to echo my fellow board members, and I guess as the senior board member here, I want to thank you and the whole team for not just the presentation, but what you do every single day, because that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's what makes us such a great place. It's always been interesting to me that since I've been on the board, public education was created, like you said in your presentation, to create participants in a democratic society. And that's been our role for a long time. And while that's been there forever, what has happened is the world has changed, right? When I went to school, we had this textbook. When my kids were in school, they have the world. And so it always amazes me, and this goes back to Dr. Dudley, we're teaching kids for a future that we have no idea what it's going to be and the jobs that they're going to be, and to make them be able to evaluate what's a good source and what's not such a good source is a skill, and to be able to put themselves in other people's places and make it interesting, because it's easy to memorize the presidents. It's a lot harder to know who was a good president and why. So not really a question, but just a thank you and a comment.
Thank you. A couple things is I loved it. I love the example, the Rosa Parks thing that we did. I thought was great. I love it that I wasn't the only one who didn't. We were both like, you learned something, I learned something. I thought that was fantastic. Growing up, it was like Christopher Columbus, 1492, Nita Pinta Santa Maria, got that down. But then as you grow and your kids come home and they're like sharing information and all these different things, you're like, whoa, and I do love that is like, you talk about layering and starting in first grade about the past, what happened last week, and building upon those foundations, I do think is so supremely important. So I appreciate that approach. Couple questions I do have for you is, how are the committees selected on who works on this? I love how it's a very diverse set of people, but how does that work? And then if you're on that, what kind of commitment is that?
With our committees, we actually work pretty much exclusively with the CTA. We say, we want to make sure at the elementary, for example, we want to have representation of all of our grade levels, also have high ability representation as well. And then we ask for people, and then they give us people, and then we kind of fill in the gaps. If they're missing a few grade levels, we'll reach out to people and do admin appointees, so we have a full committee. At our middle school and high school, same thing. We work with our CTA. A little bit different when we get into the high school. We try to pick teachers that are representative of different types of courses. So we try to make sure we have lots of teachers who are representing our kind of required courses, world history, U.S. history, government, econ, and then also some AP representation. So some of our teachers cross over into both of those areas. as well as IB, so that we have lots of different types of courses represented in those conversations as well. So, and then middle school, we pick, same thing, CTA. We just said we take our DCs who are 8th grade, we grab another CTA appointee for 8th grade, and then we ask for a 6th and 7th grade representative from every school.
And what about parents?
Parents, I work with the principals directly, and I say, do you have somebody who you think would be interested and would be a good committee member? And then they just give me some names to work with, and I invite people. We tried to, in elementary, have a parent from, I believe we had for social studies, I think I had 3 at the elementary, so we try to have one parent representing kind of each feeder school area. For middle school, we had one parent per middle school, and then the high school, I think we had 3 to 4 parents on those committees, and then 2 students. And then in terms of time commitment, this was a very compacted process, so I would have to look back and see how many. We did half-day meetings in most cases. Probably we did, I want to say maybe 4 half-days for each committee area, but then we also had work that was done via Canvas, and within even our departments, we went back and pushed work out within the department, so other teachers would have voices as part of the process in between those meetings. So 4 formal meetings, probably, I can't quite remember, but also kind of lots of little touch points in between.
Thank you. One of the things I loved, and you did it with kind of the project that we worked on today, was you talked about the legitimate sources. I thought that was something that, and that's something that, I have a 8th grader, and I'm like, she shares something. I was like, where'd you get that? She's like, TikTok. I was like, like one of those things of like, where's the information coming from? And I thought you did a really good job of just explaining to us, like, this was a direct interview, this was this. So I thought that that was something of teaching our students, of how do you realize what a legitimate source is. So I think that that is something that, transcends, just social studies. So I love that. Can you talk to me a little bit about aligning with Indiana standards? So you talk about the open sourcing and the adjusting and the pulling in those different kind of sources. So all of that stuff does need to align with Indiana curriculum and, different sorts of things that they talk about. Can you talk a little bit, to the board and to those who are watching, what we need to do to make sure that we do follow the recommendations and the standards from the state?
Sure. Everything we do starts with the standards. So we don't go outside of our state standards. So what we do with the standards, though, is that we look at all of our standards, and then, and really with our secondary, we talked about figuring out the priority, really down to about, of all those standards, selecting about a third that would be our priority standards. So that doesn't mean we don't teach the other standards, but our priority standards are the ones we spend the most time on, and also are the ones that we summatively assess. So those are the ones that we say at the end of this experience, if a student is in our classroom and they've learned well, this is what they should know at the end, these kind of priority standard pieces. The other standards become supporting standards, and they're used in reference to the priority standards. So one of the first things we did this work actually before we even looked at textbooks, which really annoyed my committee because they really wanted to get into textbooks. But we knew that if we went straight to the textbooks, we'd end up with the same problem we always end up with, which is kind of the same old broad content. So we really said, what is it that we need kids to know? We took our standards and we started sorting them out and pulling out what was meant to be, what we want it to be priority. And then talking about how we could thematically group those. This is more so in 6 through 12, around questions of inquiry, or those compelling questions. And then once we figured that out, then we pushed the supporting standards underneath those and figured out where those fit. Then we looked to what materials would best help us teach those standards well. So instead of picking a program because we like the program and the kind of the elements of the program, we said, here's what we care about in terms of teaching. Here's what we want to prioritize. These tools will help us do that the best. So a little bit different approach, which teachers like to start with the materials, and in social studies it seems obvious because most books go chronology, in a chronology. But we kind of upset that a little bit, the apple cart on that a little bit, and said, how can we teach this a little bit differently and group our standards a little differently? So still challenging, we're still working on that, especially in some of our broader courses, like in 6th and 7th, where 6th grade we do Western World, 7th grade we do Eastern World. and you explore kind of the region, culture, religion, economics, geography of each area from ancient Civ to modern day. Gets a little more tricky, but that's work we're still working on, and really trying to align our materials with what we want to learn instead of figuring out what we want to learn based on our materials.
Thank you. I think that's all I have. Again, thank you so much for time. Again, our sentiments, please share that with the team and the committee that you worked with. I also just want to finish with echoing what Louise said. It is amazing the stuff that, and I, as a parent, I appreciate it. The look that we have, the transparency we have within Canvas, to look at the textbooks, to look at the homework, to see all the things, because not only is that good for us to help our students, but we learn too, and it makes the world a better place. So I appreciate all the stuff that you do and the staff does to make sure that all that information is available to us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have anything?
Thanks for looking at me and giving me at least one little opening to say something. That first off, let's give her a hand. That was an amazing presentation. Secondly, as a former research teacher, it did my heart good to talk about primary sources and secondary sources, and I think you guys really brought it home about the importance of using those different sources and having that autonomy to look and weigh, and because I don't know of a skill that's going to be more important for our kids as they get older than to be able to find out what is a credible source and how they can figure out what's real and what's not real, because there's so much information getting sent their way almost 24/7 these days. One thing we didn't talk too much about, though, is, which was my favorite part, was that we were teaching kids how to argue. And so, we always say that we're not teaching kids what to think, we're teaching them how to think. And that idea that students can look at the primary sources of, that are factual, and then look at opinions from other people and piece all that puzzle together, and then determine on their own what they believe is true about this. But not only do they get to express what their conclusion is on the argument, they're also able to accept an argument from somebody else and listen to it and go, I see where you're coming from. I'm not buying it, but I see where you're coming from. And so that whole idea that we teach our kids how to think critically and to use different sources and make sure they're trying to figure out the value of those sources and then put together their argument and then have that discussion is really, really rich. And if you're a teacher and you've ever had that lesson plan in your classroom, that's when you drive home going, wow, today was really good. So congratulations on the good work well done. And I got to tell you guys, social studies adoption is hard. The number of standards in social studies is astronomical. So for them to do that work is really, it's a heavy lift, and I really appreciate the work's been done. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we will now move on to the exciting workshop topic of I gotta do that to you, Mr. McMichael, of the presentation of the 2023 Carmel Clay School budget, which is very important, and we are so thankful for the time that you put into this. So over to you.
Thank you. I just want you to know that this will be my 43rd presentation of an annual budget, and an hour ago I wasn't particularly stressed or anxious. Now I'm both. So. And next year, I want to go first. Write that down, because I'll forget by next year. All right, well, let me begin by sharing that the school district has 5 major funds. Usually, when you hear people talking about the school budget, they're usually talking about the education fund, which certainly is the major fund, but the fact is we have 5 funds. And the education fund, we have 2 referendum funds, an operating referendum, which supports the education fund, school safety referendum, which the board's quite aware of, and then an operations fund, and finally a debt service fund. So here are those 5 funds again, and the dollar amounts proposed for the 23 budgets. You can see that our total the education fund is $118 million, but our total budgets are $216 million. So there is more to the school's budgets than just the education fund, as you can see here. The education fund's primarily for student instruction and learning. the operating referendum, which we're so blessed to have, and have our community approve, provides, as you can see, $27.7 million. And it's really additional funds to support the education fund, and more so previously supported what was the general fund. A lot of what's in our operating referendum previously was in the general fund. And so if we didn't have an operating referendum, we would be transferring those expenses to the operations fund. And of course, the money received from the state would transfer with those expenses. So this enables a little less. In fact, we did that the first year when these funds changed, but there's a little less administrative overhead by doing it the way we do. And then the operations fund, as the name implies, excuse me, covers transportation, bus replacement, capital projects, and a certain amount of our technology as well. And then the debt service primarily repays our debt obligations. And then finally, the most recent new fund that we have is the school safety referendum, which, as the board's aware, provides for our school resource officers, our student therapy program in the schools, and other safety-related types of expenses. So I'll go through each fund and highlight the revenue for those funds, as well as the expenses and some of the major assumptions or just facts that went into arriving at these numbers. So starting, and I generally present the education and referendum fund together because they're so closely tied in terms of what they're used for. And you can see here that the total for those two funds is the revenue is $146 million. Excuse me. The education fund is funded from state sources, state revenue, which is primarily sales and income tax. It's all, of course, taxpayer funds. And the state formula was based on a decrease actually this year of 98 students. We started this process, of course, in early summer, and so our most recent insight to the enrollment, which is coming right up in just a couple of days, we think we'll be down close to 200 students. And so for each student is funded for us, about $6,800. So and you've heard about money follows a child. So when you lose enrollment, that's about $6,800 per student less that will receive. And so it does matter, and it works the other way when the enrollment's increasing. In my opinion, Amy and Tom both did a very good job this year of first they're aware. We could see eventually we had a pretty good idea that we're trending down on enrollment. So that's reflected also in the staffing. So the revenue's less, but the expenses are less as well. The staffing alone doesn't offset the loss in revenue, at least not in 1 year, because while it's simplistically stated and seems reasonable that the money follows the child, but the funding not only, of course, covers the classroom teacher, which is about 65 to 70% of the cost of educating the child, but it also covers other administrative, principals and front office people and media specialists. And so if you lose, relatively few students out of 16,000 in each school, you still have the media specialists and you still have the art, music, and PE teacher and so forth. So that percentage of the total is much harder to get at, and in fact, you don't get at it with 1 year or 2 years drop in enrollment. Which is what makes it incredibly hard for districts that have consistent declining enrollment. But on the other hand, and from a funding standpoint, our referendum fund is driven by a tax rate of 19 cents. And so, as we're all aware, we've had high inflation, high increases in property values and so forth. And so you can see here that our operating levy is going up almost 13%. And that's needed for two reasons. One, our expenses for the school district are going up as well in terms of inflation. We're certainly impacted by inflation, the same as individuals are. And then secondly, that increase in the local referendum will help to offset the loss of enrollment for this year. So financially, I'm very optimistic that, and feels and certain really that we'll be able to manage this downturn in enrollment, but it is challenging. You can see here then on the expenditures, the 23 budget is on a calendar year, excuse me, but the funding is on a fiscal year. So the funding formula is provided by the state. It's referred to as the biennium, and so we have a formula for 2 years. And so this particular budget, we have the formula for 22-23, so we can be a lot more precise in terms of what the revenue is going to be. But 23-24 is really an estimate or a guess, frankly, because there is no formula. We certainly, we haven't settled any salary agreements or contracts. So both the revenue and the expenditures are up for grabs, is what I'm saying, for 23-24, and that's about half of this budget. So for 23-24, you can see here that the salary and benefit increases were assumed to be the same as 22-23. Not because I think they will be, but that's the one known that we have, and so I felt that it's at least understandable as to what we're doing. Because anything else, I would be just, guessing, and then when it didn't turn out that way, somebody would say, well, you said it would be X, Y, and Z. So I try to not put us in that situation. And so I'd highlight benefits because I feel very good about our insurance benefits and the related premiums. None of us like an increase, but the fact is that a 3% increase in the current trend for health insurance is over 10%, and a little higher than that for prescription drugs. So we continue to do very well with the cost of our benefits, and have for really the last almost 10 years. And as you know, we believe that a large part of that is what we're doing locally with our wellness center and our efforts to maintain healthy and support healthy and well-being with our employees. So this slide then is showing just a graphic of our projected cash balance in these funds, and you can see it's maintaining pretty level. It's actually going up a little bit. It's showing we're showing on the left-hand side a decline by the end of 22, and you'll notice, well, notice that the January 1st cash balance is an actual cash balance. The next two are projected, and I emphasize that because one of the things about this is not the document, by the way, that we use to manage the school corporation. That may seem odd, but because of the way the system works and the bureaucracy associated, this budget has to be approved by the state. And when they approve that, the process that they will go through is they will assume, for example, this is just one example, but they will assume that we will expend our entire budget. So whatever it is, they're going to assume we expend it. And that's what's assumed here, because if I assumed anything else, they'll change it. And so the fact is that we won't consume the entire budget. At the very least, we'll have outstanding, what's called encumbrances or purchase orders, you might think of it that way, and which in some of these funds may be $2 or $3 million, particularly in the operations fund. As you can imagine, construction projects, things like that. And so they're going to assume those are actually expended, but they won't be. And in addition to that, we may or may not use all the appropriation that we have in the first place for the budget. So So in summary, I would say that I believe actually that our cash balances, if anything, they'll tend to be higher than this rather than lower. Because again, that's one day in time on December 31st or in this case, December 31st. But it does give us an indication. We certainly keep an eye on that. And but there's a lot more insight and information behind just where the cash balance is at on that particular day. So then going to the operations fund, see here the revenue's $31.8 million. Let me back up just a second because I want to emphasize, as we heard the presentation, and I do want to emphasize that in our education referendum fund, you can see that 92% of this fund's salary and benefits, which shouldn't be surprising because, you know, we're a people business, and almost all of this is directly in the classroom, first with teachers and also instructional assistants. So those of us sitting up here are not in this fund. We're now in the operations fund, and outside the classroom, generally speaking, is supported with other funds besides the education fund. So the majority of the money is spent on people and not on non-personnel type of things. So, but in the operations fund, you can see first with the revenue that most, with the exception of the education fund, the other four funds, all the money comes from local sources, which means property tax, excise tax, and primary, as you can see here, 88% property tax, and 8% of other local taxes, excise tax primarily, and then a little bit of financial institutions tax. So again, this fund is represented and it's impacted by an increasing assessed value. But as I stated, our expenses are going up as well. So there's a relationship between when there's inflation, it oftentimes impacts property, but it also, in our case, impacts which impacts our revenue, but it also impacts expenditures because the inflation affects pretty much everything we're doing as well. So you can see on the expenses, the same assumptions relative to salary and benefits. And then the other expenses, those are our best estimates based on current trends and the information that we have. Same thing here, you see the cash balance. This moves around a little bit more because of the nature of the fund, and you've heard me share this with the monthly updates. It depends what we're doing with like construction projects and things like that are not, the expenses aren't every 2 weeks like salaries would be. Then we do have 2 plans that are advertised. A capital projects plan, which is noted here, includes expenditures that exceed $10,000 for various capital assets, and then a bus replacement plan, which is based on a 12-year replacement cycle, and however the plan now is 5 years. Then going to our debt service, I would point out, and each column here represents a bond issue and thus an indebtedness. And you'll see starting on the left that our 2019 bonds will retire in 2 years. The next one will retire in 2023, and then another one that will retire in 2 years. Those are all of these really are reflecting very short payoff schedules, which we've talked about before. The next one then reflects the 2 new elementary schools that we opened last year. Then we have another, when it says first mortgage bond, that means it's a building corporation. When it's a general obligation bond, it's a local bond that obligations directly to the school district. And then the last one is the natatorium, and you can then see the total debt. The large one that I would point out is the third one from the left. You can see it's $11.6 million a year annual payment, and that reflects, we did a lot of work in the early 2000s, built Creekside, built the Freshman Center, renovated both the other two middle schools, and we're also building a school, an elementary school about every 2 years. So that was a very large bond issue that you can see was sold in 2 series, and so it's about to be paid off. Here you'll see the same thing with cash balance. In Indiana, we're permitted by statute to carry a certain amount of cash balance in the debt service fund. Several years ago, for years, it was 50% of whatever the debt payment was. In Indiana, if a school corporation failed to make a bond payment, it would fall to the state. So, of course, the state doesn't want to be responsible for our debt, so the system allows for the local school district to, essentially, it did allow for us to, a local school district to maintain a 6-month operating balance so that you pay these debt payments twice a year, and they're doing everything they can to ensure that a school district wouldn't find itself without money to make that payment. More recently, that was changed to 15%. I guess after a number of years, they trust us a little more, I guess. But at any rate, so it's lowered, so the amount is not as much as it used to be. But this cash balance, as a practical matter, helps us with cash flow. Because particularly on those 4 funds that are supported with property taxes, you know, we primarily get property tax twice a year. So all the salaries that we're paying are every 2 weeks, not twice a year. And so we need a certain amount of cash for cash flow purposes. And this fund actually helps us with that. And then we go in summary to the levies and the rates. I'd start at the bottom and point out that we continue to be able to manage and maintain our tax rate at the same level. We have not increased the tax rate. I would also, however, within that, point out that the safety referendum, we are raising it. The first 3 years, the rate was approved at a maximum of 5 cents. We pledged to the community that we wouldn't tax at 5 cents just because we could. And so we've taxed at 3.5 cents. As you might imagine, the first year of that, we were not fully staffed with our school resource officers, for example, or our mental health people. It took a couple of years actually to get that off the ground completely. And so we are now fully staffed. And so that's the really good news, but we also need more money to cover the expense. At the same time, you'll note in the operations fund that because that fund is controlled with a maximum levy, which just means maximum dollars, then the rate, it doesn't take a 33-cent rate as it did this year to raise that maximum amount of money. Now, next year, because of the increased assessed value, it'll only take a 30-cent rate. So that, from a rate standpoint, that's offsetting. In this case, it's offsetting the penny and a half in the safety referendum. So the end result is we continue to maintain the rate. Now, any number of and we hear from some taxpayers, they'd say, well, why don't you lower the rate? And that's not actually a bad thing. And even somebody like myself doesn't see it as a bad thing. It's just, again, we're trying to manage currently some declining enrollment and the impact of inflation. And so between those two, we did not feel we could responsibly lower the rate without jeopardizing the stability of the school corporation, because we absolutely would spend, if we did that, we would spend more money than we're bringing in, which is just another way of saying we're going to spend down reserves. And we're currently at what we consider our minimum reserves to begin with. We're trying to actually increase them a little bit, not decline them at this point. We do feel that, as painful as it is, that the economy tends to be cyclical, and so we don't see the inflationary rate staying where it's at, kind of like for the foreseeable future. And so, as painful as it is, we believe it will get better, and that goes into the consideration of the rate as well. So, in summary, then, this is about a 3-step process. Give the presentation this evening. We'll later ask for your approval to advertise for a public hearing so that that this information that the public basically has an opportunity to comment on this, everything that I just shared with you. And then eventually on October the 24th, I'll ask for your approval of these budgets. And while you approve them, they still don't go into place until they're in place January, until the state approves them. And which after the board's approval, then they'll be submitted to the Department of Local Government Finance. They'll review them, and by December 31st, they'll certify the tax rates, and they'll approve a budget for us. I'm presuming it'll be this budget, but they certainly have the right to, to make a change if they said we're assuming more money than's legally available to us, things like that. So they're the final say in terms of what the budget will be approved at, is what I'm saying. And so I'll stop there and try to respond to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. McMichael. I appreciate, we teased you earlier, but this is such an important role as us as school board members, and then also as our guiding principles about how we'll be fiscally responsible. So I appreciate that. I had a couple questions. I'll kind of start off and I'll kind of open it up to the board. The decrease of students, I know what was anticipated? Was this anticipated? How, can you talk a little bit more of the narrative behind that?
Yes, Carmel's had declining enrollment the last 3 years. That's the first time, I think, in history that that's happened. And certainly in the time that I've been here, we've always been a growing school corporation. That growth has varied over the years, in some cases quite a bit. And we have not been growing relatively very many students. We used to grow, as I said, we'd build an elementary school about every 2 or 3 years because we're growing 500 kids a year. We've not been in that case for a long time. We also had our demographic study updated, as luck would have it, about a year before the pandemic. And it shows in these last 3 years, it indicated slight growth, but we've had, decline. And so we believe that the declines for a whole variety of reasons. You hear people say, I can't even find a house in Carmel to buy. And if I do find it, I can't afford it because of the inflationary rate. I mean, all these things. And certainly there's the pandemic, and we're still trying to understand, what the impact of that is. So there's a number of things going on, but we know for sure that there's some impact of people that would like to move to Carmel, and other places, but right now they're staying put, and so that's part of it. But it does affect, our budgets and our operation.
Well, and my understanding was, and you kind of touched about it a little bit, it wasn't an anticipated decline, and that's one of the reasons with Dr. Ostrike and everything, where we anticipated that, and so we put our staffing accordingly.
Yes.
It wasn't something that we were completely surprised with. So
No, and even, I'll say even less so this year, because we did have declining enrollment last year, and I think it's fair to say that the first year in particular, kind of, we were much more surprised than we were this year. This year we, kept, we always keep a very close eye on the enrollment, whether it's plus or minus. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but we knew that, because the tendency is if when the enrollment comes in less, at the high school, for example, we're staffing the high school in the spring, right? So that's pretty early but you still have to make an assumption on what your enrollment's going to be as you're staffing and building, and then building a schedule. So it's much more challenging to react to declining enrollment at the secondary level because there's schedules involved and so forth. Whereas the elementary, we literally, Amy, I think, watches it about every night. So you can make a change if necessary at the elementary, almost up to the beginning of school. We don't like to do that, of course, and we didn't this year, but you can get a lot closer with it. And so the elementary, for sure, our staffing is right on. I mean, in terms of and by that I mean in terms of our our class sizes and so forth. They have been adjusted as far as the number of staff. It's adjusted down, which reflects any decline in enrollment. Not that the decline was just at the elementary level, but in fact, I think the majority of it may have been at the secondary level. But the staffing is adjusted either up or down as the enrollment fluctuates.
Thank you. Another thing is mainly a note is, property values are up and that affects us, but it's the exact same when property values are down.
Yes, we
So
had that too during the
yes.
recession.
So it's definitely, each one kind of affects our schools, and that's another reason why we're so thankful for that referendum, because that really helps make a difference. One thing I wanted to point out, and this is really a kudos to you, as that financial leader of our district, is that short payoff schedule. That is so amazing that we are having these bonds that are being paid off so fast. And then also, if you've been paying attention to school board meetings and we've talked about approving these bonds, the rates that we get. I mean, that is showing that, Carmel Clay Schools is a safe and smart investment. And so I think that really goes to say also about our financial stability and everything. So, I'm so appreciative of, the work that you guys do and the board and everything, because I think that is so important. The last thing is kind of a comment too, is that, we made a pledge to our community when we did the safety referendum that we would not utilize the money unless we needed to, and we didn't. We worked, we wanted to make sure that our SRO staff was highly trained and accessible, and that took some time, which I'm glad, even though that we don't like that it took time, I'm glad that we made sure that the right people were for the job and everything. And so now that we are to that fully staffed point, which we are all so proud and happy about, we do have to make sure we pay for that. And so then kind of going back and saying, all right, we're going back, we're going to what we told you, and that now we need the money, and so we're kind of doing that increase. So I think that that's so important and a good reminder of, we didn't take it when we didn't need to.
Right.
Now we need to, and if we don't need to again, we'll go back and everything.
Right.
So just a couple comments there. All right, and now I'm going to kind of turn it over to the board. Do you guys have any questions or comments?
Well, Katie, you struck about 3 things off my list, so
Okay.
thank you for that. And Roger, I want to thank you. You did a very nice job. It's a complex topic, and I know that the actual budget is yay thick. So, and I know we'll see that as well. So thank you. And as Katie said, this evening, our guiding principles, we started with students that are at the center of every decision, and we ended with responsible management of our finances. And it is no accident that those are the first and the last ones in our guiding principles. So that's it. So 2 things. One, I always think it's important to thank our taxpayers. When I'm looking at the numbers, about 33 million out of 216 million, or 16%, is our Carmel citizens agreeing to tax themselves. And so we are thankful for that. We appreciate the increase that the state has given us every year, but we would not be able to do what we're able to do without that. And then the last comment I have is there's obviously a lot of planning going into keeping our tax rate level. And like you said, there's pluses and minuses. And I think we do a great job with keeping it level so that we're not asking for more one year and less the next year, and it's predictable. And the work that goes into making that happen is not easy. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I want to emphasize that we got a lot of good people that work here. So, and I certainly have a lot of support and assistance, and also from you guys and this guy. So, without all that, it just doesn't work this way.
Ms. Jackson?
I just have a couple more granular questions, and you might just tell me where to find these things. But one is, how do I look at or find the impact of the switch out for lunches being covered or subsidized now to us paying us, I say us parents, paying for that? It's at the forefront of my mind because my son overspends every day. And the second thing is the impact of less bus routes, right? I'm still in the school of understanding our budgets. So how do I find those more granular?
So first with food service, which is different than the transportation part, which I'll speak to in a minute. But so food service, is a separate fund, so you can't find it in here. We can make it available to you certainly, but the short answer to your question is for the last 2 years, we were getting, we were able to provide no-cost lunch because it was being funded by the federal government. So we went from receiving payments from parents, basically. We get money from the government regardless, but not like it has been the last 2 years. And so we went, what replaced the parent money was money, from the federal government. And so if you saw the bookkeeping, that's the change that you would see on where's the money coming from. The expenses didn't change a lot, but certainly not like the revenue did. So that was a switch, and it's not out there like these tax supported funds, and that's a significant difference because our food service program is not a tax supported fund. So these 5 we probably have 60 funds, by the way. When I talk about 5, it's really the 5 tax supported funds. Okay. And that we have food service is a large fund, but it's not tax supported. It's through self-sustaining through fees and so forth, and anything from the federal government. So it's tax in that sense, but not like property tax. And then, but transportation is a part of the operations fund now. And and you will receive, and we post this on our website as well, but you will see kind of the details of the budget itself in terms of the, now again, there's more pages, in more detail in our accounting system, but it's a multi-page document that shows at least the major expenses for school buses or bus driver salaries and benefits and so forth. And so with regard to the, we have, at probably at least 30 or so fewer bus drivers than we once had. We also pay the remaining ones more money and they do more work. So now I believe virtually every driver is driving. Traditionally, bus drivers for Carmel they would run 2 routes in the morning, an elementary route and a secondary route, and then they'd reverse that and take kids home in the afternoon. Now they're running 3 routes, and they'll do elementary, middle, and high, and or some combination, or more likely they might do 2 elementary runs for some of them. That's when we talk about early buses or double routes. And so that's the terminology, but they're running an additional route or 2, first of all, in the morning, and then again reversing at night. So they're if you think of it like we have a third less drivers, but the remaining ones are doing a third more work to make up for the, and it's not quite that simple, which is also why we have, the no bus zones that we've had to implement and so forth. But so it's, again, like this budget, it's not quite that simple, but that's the big piece of how it works, and so we're spending, and it's not an exact offset, but we're the reduced bus drivers isn't the money, the expenditures haven't reduced accordingly because we're paying the drivers that we do have more money to run more routes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the board? And then I just have one follow-up question with the lunching, to make sure, and because I know this has come up recently, because sometimes I feel like Finding Nemo, where I have short-term memory loss, because 2 years of not paying lunches.
Yep.
So the lunch program is not for profit. We're not making any money.
Correct.
And also, you talked about spending more on your son. Parents do have the option to contact their cafeteria manager to kind of set those kind of standards of no extras, doubles, all those sorts of things. So
Yeah,
just
all that's available through the SIST software and stuff that we have. We can put it so they can't charge anything and do
yeah,
it. And the parents can see what they do charge.
Yes.
As well. So
what they eat, you can, and I think that's something that came out recently, is where you kind of, like most parents, we set up the automatic withdrawals, and so then you're like, what are you eating? And it's because you got 3 chicken sandwiches in one day.
I might suggest you might ask them. I know from experience of when did you eat all those cookies, or did you give some to your friends?
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
buy for everybody.
Yes, carte blanche, you know?
Yeah,
So,
I've got a card.
yes,
I'll
exactly.
cover this.
And I'm sure it happens. So anyway, just kind of a little
Yeah,
good, you know, that's, it kind of brings up a good reminder to our families that you have access to see, you know, how much money that your students are spending at lunch, what they're actually buying, and you can definitely speak to the cafeteria managers and go through the system in order to get that updated. But we promise we're not, you know, bringing lots of money with Smart Pop or whatever
Yeah,
it is.
we're
But
definitely not doing that.
so anyway, great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you.
McMichael. The budget schedule is something that definitely will be advertising coming out in future meetings. I really appreciate it. We will now move on to some action items. Action items are not something typically we do at a workshop unless it is something that's more time sensitive, which is exactly what this is. So kind of moving on to action item 5.1, permission to advertise the 2023 budgets, the capital projects plan, and the bus replacement plan to conduct a public hearing. Do you have anything more to add about that, Mr. Michael?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to approve this? Thank you, Ms. Nelson Williams. A second? Second. Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries 4-0. Next action item is 5.2, implementation of procurement cards. Mr. McMichael?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm kind of excited about this. Procurement cards would look a whole lot like a credit card. But there are differences, and a significant difference for us is that although this I think applies to some credit cards, but we get rebates when we use a procurement card. And of course, these are all sanctioned by the State Board of Accounts and so forth. But what it's really doing, it's our first step in moving toward these procurement cards for purchasing and moving away from the traditional purchase orders. And so, as you can imagine, on the amount of purchasing that we do, we're talking about several $1,000s. That 1.5% adds up, in other words, when you apply that to several $1 million and over a year. And secondly, what's not as obvious, but to write a purchase order costs a certain amount of money. You might have heard in business, if you write an order, it might cost you $30 because somebody has to receive you have to put information in, receive it. It has to be, the purchase order is written. It has to be, it has to get to the vendor to order the stuff. And there's a whole process associated with that. So this is much more efficient approach. And it's really, very solid from a control standpoint and accounting. Operationally, it will help our principals and others, but I think of our principals who on occasion need a more timely method to acquire certain things than a purchase order. They don't, if they're having, this is a small example, but if they're having a meeting, for example, and they need to bring it, it's an all-day meeting and they're going to stay and work through lunch and so forth, so they need to bring in lunch. Well, you can't already write a purchase order to a restaurant, wait for it to get written, and it just doesn't work. So there's other examples, but sometimes we have with travel arrangements and things. So this will is a really positive step in terms of our increasing of the efficiency of the purchasing process, really. And so we would recommend your approval of this resolution, which is the details of that resolution are outlined in the statute.
Thank you. All right, do I hear a motion to approve 5.2, implementation of procurement cards? So moved. Thank you, Mr. Kirshner. Do I have a second? Second. Thank you, Ms. Nelson Williams. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor of the 5.2, implementation of procurement cards, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries 4-0.
Thank you.
Goodness, need to go to bed. Thank you. All right, we will now turn over to our reports. Dr. Michael Beresford.
Well, it's been an exciting night. Roger, that was your best, I think. That was thrilling, and we'll give you a hand for that as well. That's good. Really, You really brought it. I really like the procurement cards at the end there, just showing that if there's a dime to be found, you're going to find it, and we're going to add that into the pot. So I appreciate that too. It was a great night. Amy, you and your team, that adoption was amazing, and really appreciate the work there. And really, the parents, the students, everyone involved in that, teachers, that's a heavy lift, and appreciate that. And as you can tell, school budgets are very complex, and Roger kind of goes through it because he's been doing it for so long, like it's just what we do. But it's full of assumptions and projections, and to be able to do that at the right point so that you're not going too far, and saving, making the margin too big, but at the same time you have to make it, a decent margin so in case something goes the other way. And especially this last with the, with the inflation that's going on and a lot of the assessed valuations going up, the balancing act was very difficult this time around. So really appreciate your work there, and I know it's not simple. But hey, I'll hit you with my report here, and I'm going to start with yesterday because yesterday was 9/11, and when 9/11 falls on the weekend, sometimes I think there's a tendency to kind of go past it. But yesterday was the 21st anniversary of the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, and that's always been a somber day for me because it takes me back now 21 years ago when school had already started, and I want to say it was probably after the passing period, the second period was when the first plane hit the tower, and then shortly after that, the second plane. And I just remember how almost every minute of that morning, what happened is we were trying to process what was happening, and then how are we going to respond to this with a school full of kids and parents, getting this information out in the community. So it was kind of a gut check time for everybody that day, and also for our country. And as the day grew, the devastation became greater. Almost by the hour. And we learned a lot of lessons through all that. But two great lessons that we learned was one is that we learned of great tragedy in human lives, and also that there was evil in the world, and that still seeks to kill and destroy, our neighbors and our people. Yet we also learned that heroes live among us, and that our people come together to help and save one another, and sometimes even at the cost of their own lives. So I think that it's important to learn that love conquers evil every time. But sometimes it's not as quick as we wish it was. But I hope we'll remember these lessons and that we won't forget what happened on 9/11, and we take those lessons to heart and as we move forward. Kind of appropriate when we talked about history, that how history impacts the past, but it also can be significant to the present and the future. So now I'll move on to your more typical superintendent's report and talk a little bit about in the world of sports. I don't know if you saw the picture that was posted of the girls golf team that won. They win. They are on fire. They're ranked number 1 in the state. But the picture that they took of their win at the last one, the clouds were actually behind them and sunbeams were coming down. I was like, boy, these girls have really got it going on. Even the sky is participating. But they're really on fire and doing a great job. Also, our boys cross country team is ranked number 1 in the state. And I don't know if you guys are cross country nerds like me, but they won one of the most competitive cross country races this weekend. I think 6 of the top 10 teams were in that race, and of course the team won. And that pack of hounds averaged 15 minutes and 27 seconds for a 5K. That's 3.1 miles. That's fast. If you don't know. And then Cole Matheson, he ran 14:52 to break the course record, and this has been run at Eagle Park in Brown County for years. And whose record he broke? His own from the year before. so Cole's having a great year. All of our fall sports are on upward trends. It's really exciting, and it's fun to watch the kids doing what they do and to get better at it. And win, lose, or draw, we are behind our kids there. Also, Wednesday, the National Merit semifinalists come out. Now, that information is embargoed, so I can't tell you what the number's going to be, but you're going to like it. And so I'm always amazed by our top scholars when this day comes every year. It's crazy how well they do and how high they achieve. So I'm going to congratulate them in advance, but I'm not going to give out any info. So Emily made me promise, so that's as far as I'm going. Also, and this may be news you already know, but our marching band's preparing to go to the Macy's Day Parade. So that's a big deal going. If you haven't seen their halftime show yet, their show this year is crazy. It's just absolutely crazy. It's super fast. There's a lot of things spinning. There's rifles being caught around another kid. I mean, it's just like a wild. It's just a wild show. So I'm really interested to see how that's. Every week they add another layer to it, and this one's going to be amazing, I'm sure. Thought I'd throw a little construction news at you. The CHS auditorium renovation is almost complete, so it's getting real close. So we should be opening the auditorium pretty soon, and hopefully in time for our concerts that are coming up. Also, Phase 2 of the Lexington Avenue roundabout is about ready to start. So they had to get some telephone poles moved and everything, so those have been moved out of the way. So there's going to be 2 more phases to complete that project by the city. And so that's getting ready to go. Work on the new natatorium's continuing, and we're staying ahead there. And then the trail sidewalk has now been connected all the way to door 17. So they had put a temporary kind of asphalt path while they were pouring that concrete path. So now it's wide and beautiful. And what I like about it best is there's no traffic that crosses that walk from after they cross to the sidewalk down by the stadium. They walk all the way to door 17 without any cars crossing their way. So it's a lot safer. So we're looking forward to the opening of the library. And I'm just coining this phrase. I don't know if anybody is interested in it, but they're opening the library as our learning district is inching closer to the finish line. So, we have the arts district. I think we have a learning district right there, just saying. So my bell ringer. Bell ringer for tonight is what I'm calling Friday Night Lights. And as you might have heard already, the Hounds are victorious over Pike on Friday night. But my bell ringer is not about the actual game. It started by when I received a message from Dr. Ferris about a note from the officiating crew that he had received. So these are the officials, the referees of the football game. The crew described the wonderful organization and treatment that they experienced, and especially noted the often off and on-field character of our team, coaches, and the athletic department. The official even went on to comment that even when questioning a call, our people were professional and appropriate. The note closed with the crew stating that Carmel High School is an example of how all sporting contests should be done. So kudos to all the people that work so hard to make those events go off. And when you have an event like that with thousands and thousands of people, it's no easy task. Now, if that didn't make you feel good inside and proud, that night after the game was over, as all the students and fans were filing out of the stands, do we have a picture we can put up? Okay. We'll wait for a dramatic effect. These 5 students caught my attention, and they were walking up and down the student section, picking up all the trash that was left behind. And I asked them if I could take their picture, and then I found out that Dr. Ferris had already taken their picture because it caught his attention too, I guess. But I wanted to know that I let them know that they are now in the Dr. Beresford Hall of Fame for their service beyond the call of duty. And this is Thomas, and I'm sorry about the name pronunciation, but I'll do the best I can. But it's Thomas Hago, Max Klinke, Charlie Harder, Alex Calto, and Izzy Shepard are those 5 kids. And so they're in the Hall of Fame 2022. What a great act of service. And I drove home with a full heart after all that. So, and that concludes, well, actually, that's another reason why I love our kids. And that concludes my superintendent's report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashford. Anything else from the board? Okay. In conclusion, I just want to say, you talked a little bit, and I wanted to talk a minute about September 11th. This is going to age me, but I was in 11th grade U.S. history when that happened. And so it's so relevant to the discussion that we had tonight about how important it is to teach our students. And so I do think it was kismet that we had this presentation today about the importance of social studies and civics, and how much that really does matter. I want to take this moment to thank our first responders, our military, and also our teachers, because there is so much that we do put in their responsibility to make sure that our kids are educated and that they're aware of all the wonderful things that our country has, and how we can all be better citizens. So thank you so much to all of those. I will now take a motion to conclude this meeting. First, Ms. Jackson, do I have a second? Second, Ms. Nelson Williams. All those in favor? Aye. Meeting adjourned.